Good morning, everybody. If I could have your attention, please. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the 1st Division Museum at Cantigny. Welcome to Cantigny. We're delighted to have all of you here. I have a few administrative announcements before I introduce our moderator. First is that we are being recorded, and we have microphones here, so in the Q&A, you'll probably have to step to the microphone. The moderator will recognize you for that purpose, and we appreciate your cooperation on that. If you've got a cell phone, please silence it or turn it off or whatever. You can see by our agenda that we have a 2-hour lunch break at 12:30. That is so that you can have enough time to visit some of the reenactment activities that are out on the grounds. There are presentations by Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln and also by Harriet Tubman. They normally take place on the brick courtyard right immediately in front of the museum, but if we have inclement weather, we'll bring them into the lobby. There's coffee. I think most of you have found it. Out the doors to your left. You go a little farther to the left, and there are restrooms and drinking fountains down that way. In the noon break, there's a special exhibit at the Robert R. McCormick Museum, which is the Colonel's historic home. It's about 500 yards that way, right across the tank park and the gardens. As you may know, that home was the originally the home of Joseph Medill, Colonel McCormick's maternal grandfather and founder of the Chicago Tribune, and a great confidant of Abraham Lincoln before Lincoln was elected president. Also, his brother, William Medill, died of wounds following the Battle of Gettysburg, serving with the 8th Illinois Cavalry. And so there is an exhibit in the McCormick Museum today on the Civil War roots of Cantigny. Let me say just a word about Cantigny for those of you who might be here for the first time, and if so, we are absolutely delighted to have you here. We hope you'll come back often. Cantigny is named for a battle. It's named for a little village in France, 75 miles north of Paris, where the United States fought its first battle for the freedom of Western Europe. And that battle was fought by the 1st Division of the American Expeditionary Forces. Colonel McCormick served in that battle in command of the 1st Battalion, 5th Field Artillery. He was so profoundly affected by his experience in World War I that when he came home to this estate, which he owned, he named it Cantigny in honor of that battle, and he was, forever thereafter, he was a great friend, supporter, patron, advocate of America's veterans and America's service members. He founded American Legion posts. He had reunions of the 1st Division here on the grounds. When he passed away in 1955, and I think everybody knows Robert McCormick, the gentleman for whom the McCormick Place is named, longtime owner, editor, and publisher of the Chicago Tribune. He died in 1955 here on the estate. He's buried over here with his wife, Amy. He was a multimillionaire. They had no children. He founded what is now the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, a major philanthropy, our parent organization whose headquarters are on Michigan Avenue. And he said, "Leave my estate as a public park for the people of Illinois." And so those of you who came from Indiana, Wisconsin, or even Connecticut are very welcome here as well. We assume that the Colonel's intent was to embrace all the people of the United States. But that's what he said. And so the first thing his Board of Trustees did is say, okay, on this park we want to have a museum to the 1st Division because the Colonel was so dedicated to the 1st Division. And that was fortuitous because that division became the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One that many of you have heard of. It has been on continuous active duty since June 1917. Not a day has gone by that we have not been served by the men and women of the Big Red One. They currently have 3,500 troops serving in Afghanistan. So that compelling history you can see in the main exhibit hall if you have time. I also encourage you to drop by the kiosk out there in the lobby and pick up the Cantini Fall Events Calendar. Lots and lots and lots of things go on here throughout the year, not just military and military-related things, and we would love to have you participate. I would be very remiss if I did not acknowledge our partners in this symposium, the National Archives of Chicago, but they're shut down. And they're the ones who do all the heavy lifting. We provide the venue, we provide the welcome, we provide the coffee, we do stuff like that, we organize the reenactment, but they invite the speakers, they set they produce all of the programs and the name tags, and they organize the whole thing, and they hold it here. And earlier this week, we received, this is how it works in the federal government. If your office is going to be shut down, you're notified by email, and it's one of those emails that it tells the sender when you've opened it. And when you open it, it starts a ticking clock by which it sets a time by which you have to be punched out, gone, off the premises, and not working for the federal government, okay? So when you open that thing, you have 30 seconds. It's a little longer than that. But at any rate, we got this frantic call from our colleagues down there, Doug Bickenese and all the other people that work so hard to make these symposia successful. And they said, look, we only got an hour and a half. We got to get out of here. We got about 15 things to do. We got all this stuff for the symposium. We'll hope we make it to the FedEx office. Otherwise, you're going to have to come down here and pick it up at my house. And they did make it to the office, and we received it all. And Laura Sears is in the back there, is organizing the registration table and welcoming you all. But anyway, we are just delighted to run this series of symposia with the National Archives of Chicago. There's literature on the table out there, and we hope that you'll take that and avail yourself of the many rich historical materials that they house here in the Chicago area. Okay, so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, who will introduce our first speaker. Ted Karamansky is from Loyola University of Chicago, where he is professor of history, and he teaches courses in American Indian history, the Civil War, and public history. He has been a leading and national voice in the promotion of American and public history for more than 3 decades, and he was the founder and later director of Loyola's public history program, the first such program in the Midwest, and later the first to offer a PhD in public history. He has a very long list of accomplishments and publications. He is a distinguished scholar, distinguished speaker. I am not going to go through all of these. He has been working with us since I became involved with this program some 4 or 5 years ago. He's been a wonderful partner. He is a teacher and mentor to many people that we have hired and then sent on to careers in public history, and very significantly, he is the author of Rally Round the Flag, Chicago in the Civil War, published by Nelson Hall in 1991, and it is my great pleasure and personal privilege to introduce Ted Karamansky.
Well, thanks for that gracious introduction. I'll try to provide a gracious introduction for our speakers. I will note that while the National Archives is not with us today, at least the archival profession is. 2 of our speakers on the program today are professional archivists, and will have the benefit of their knowledge of the great collections of the Civil War. The Civil War home front was for a long time probably the most neglected area of Civil War scholarship, with sort of, we're used to genuflecting at the typical stories of the gallant ladies of the Sanitary Commission and the controversies of Copperhead politics. But in the last few years, there's been a lot of really marvelous work done that has really enriched our understanding of what's going on the home front, particularly in the North, but certainly in the South as well. And so we've gone ahead and seen a much richer exploration of gender relations in these years. We've gone ahead and seen an exploration of the economic impact of the war and how this affected labor relations, and really, in some ways, really set up the labor conflicts of the Gilded Age that followed the Civil War. Some of the best work on the Civil War home front comes out of Indiana. And Stephen Towne, our first speaker today, is one of the major contributors to that, certainly with his marvelous collection, Indiana's War, the Civil War and Documents, part of a series with Ohio Press. Indiana probably had the most intense partisan conflicts. Wasn't simply, Republicans against Democrats, but it was state officials against federal officials, and Indiana, in many ways, brings this term home front alive because there were even military engagements involved here. So, Steve, we look forward to hearing more about that. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you. Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm sorry that my archival colleagues from the National Archives can't be here, but it's my privilege. Let's see. Oh, here we are. Just refresh my memory. This do I click this and this? Oops. Next one. Okay. Good. I just want to make sure. Thank you. Got to have pictures. Well, the year 1863 saw several significant developments in the American Civil War. First, perhaps foremost, President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation made the freedom of enslaved African American people in rebellious southern states an element of the United States war policy. As part of that emancipation policy, the United States Army began to recruit African American soldiers to serve in the ranks. Nearly 200,000 African American men served to help suppress the rebellion, restore the Union, and end slavery in the United States. Also in that year, Congress passed an Enrollment Act that established a national system of conscription, taking the mantle of authority from the states, some of which had been ineffectual in drafting conscripts in the previous year. Militarily, 1863 saw a significant, perhaps decisive, Union victory in the Vicksburg Campaign, opening the Mississippi River and cutting the Confederacy in twain. To the east, Major General William Rosecrans brilliantly maneuvered a Confederate army out of Tennessee and advanced into northern Georgia. Though repulsed at Chickamauga, Union forces prevailed at Chattanooga and drove the rebels into retreat, affording Union control over most of the Upper South. Finally, and to a lesser extent, Union victory at Gettysburg afforded hope that hapless Army of the Potomac might manage to pull triumph from the jaws of defeat. I'm a Midwesterner, so, 1863 also saw the development of a military intelligence apparatus in the states of the Old Northwest, what we today call the Midwestern states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. This intelligence bureaucracy arose to confront growing threats to the integrity of the U.S. Army in the form of rampant desertion and violent resistance to the draft. It arose in a haphazard, ad hoc, decentralized fashion through the actions of local military commanders in response to deteriorating local conditions. Officers scattered throughout the region employed civilian detectives and soldiers as spies to gather information on the sources of threats to government control. Behind these threats, officers perceived the activities of secret political organizations that aimed to subvert the war effort. In the century and a half since the rebellion, historians have long acknowledged the role of intelligence and espionage in the Civil War. However, their understanding of intelligence activities has been largely limited to tactical battlefield intelligence, how one field commander learned about the whereabouts and strength of an enemy army. Historians who have examined tactical intelligence include Edwin Fischel, who wrote extensively about military intelligence in the Army of the Potomac in Maryland and Northern Virginia. Another historian is William Feiss, whose significant book, Grant's Secret Service, follows that general's tactical intelligence efforts from his service in Missouri in 1861 to his victory in the Vicksburg Campaign and later to his supervision of the Eastern Army in Virginia in 1864 and 1865. Both historians either focus on or culminate with the Army of the Potomac. To date, little attention has been paid to the intelligence activities of other armies and commanders in the field. A peculiarity of military intelligence scholarship is a disproportionate fascination with the activities of women in secret espionage. The names of Pauline Cushman, pictured here, Rose Greenough, and Elizabeth Van Loo are well-known examples of women who defied Victorian-era gender roles out of devotion to one cause or the other. They smuggled messages through the lines or used their feminine wiles to seduce information from oversexed officers. Contemporaries reveled in such tales, which appeared in newspapers and later in potboiler accounts published after the war. Historians have seemingly come to believe that much intelligence work was done by amateur adventurers dressed in silks and corsets. As well, we have been taken in by the self-serving post-war memoirs of Alan Pinkerton and Lafayette C. Baker, who portrayed themselves as brilliant spy masters with their fingers on the pulse of the war. Edwin Fischel effectively shows that Pinkerton's erroneous estimates of Confederate strength contributed to George McClellan's paralysis in command of the Army of the Potomac. And Baker's self-important account inflates his role in intelligence gathering. Historians have given little attention to intelligence and espionage work done in areas behind the front lines, where armies did not meet in battle. This paper will address the rise of Army intelligence operations in the Old Northwest, the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois, and explain how the Army got into the business of espionage behind the lines. A small military bureaucracy arose to gather information on growing threats to government control in those states. Officers employed hundreds of soldiers and civilians as detectives and received reports from thousands of citizen informants in the region. With this investigatory tool, commanders undertook domestic surveillance operations to watch civilian non-combatants, including prominent political figures throughout the region. Ultimately, Army intelligence played a significant role in quelling riot and rebellion in the North in 1863. This story emerges from a close examination of archival records long ignored by historians. Many of those records are to be found here at the National Archives Great Lakes region here in Chicago. While our focus is on events in 1863, we need to start our story in 1861, at the beginning of hostilities initiated by the Southern rebels. In the first weeks and months of the war, the Republican governors of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois perceived that all was not well in their states. While indignation at the rebellion was widespread and masses of the northern people rallied to the flag in defense of the federal government, the sentiment was not universal. Many citizens in the North believed that the southern slave states, which formed the Confederacy, were in the right. They agreed that the states had the constitutional right to secede from the Union. In their view, the states possessed authority and not the federal government, which was merely an agent to do the states' bidding. They opposed efforts to coerce the Confederate states back into the Union. The governors of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, all Republicans and all firm supporters of the National Union, received reports from their constituents telling of opposition to the war effort and support for the rebels. Illinois Governor Richard Yates learned that many around the state voiced support for the rebels. He heard that Illinois men communicated with rebels and that some had crossed the Ohio River to join Confederate forces. Influential men like Judge David Davis, whom we know managed Lincoln's campaign in 1860, and Orville Hickman Browning, soon to be a senator, reported similar traitorous activities. Others reported that Illinois people flew secession flags in support of the rebels. The governors of Indiana and Ohio received similar tidings. Governor Oliver P. Morton of Indiana received reports of pro-South sentiment and warnings of sabotage to railroad trains carrying troops and supplies to the front. He alerted federal authorities in Washington, D.C. to the problem. Governor William Dennison of Ohio feared the rise of secret political organizations that supported the rebel movement and opposed the Union effort. Indeed, all three governors received reports about secret meetings of citizens who vowed active support for the Confederate rebellion. The organization on the lips of all the governors' informants was the Knights of the Golden Circle, a group formed in the 1850s sporting the trappings of popular fraternal organizations like the Masons or Oddfellows. In the years before the rebellion, the KGC became closely associated with the filibuster movement, which had strong support in the South to expand the reach of slavery into Latin America. Correspondents to Governor Yates reported that good Unionists had infiltrated local lodges of the KGC to learn their secrets and intentions. He and the other governors took these reports seriously. Along with the state governors, federal authorities in the Old Northwest observed disquieting underground movements. United States marshals and attorneys had the task of enforcing federal law. In the first months of the war, these newly appointed law enforcement officers reported to Attorney General Edward Bates at Washington, D.C., that they had evidence of arms and other contraband smuggling activities going between northern citizens and the rebels. They also reported that citizens alerted them to the existence of secret armed organizations that supported the Southern rebels. These federal officers took the reports seriously and investigated them. For example, the Marshal for Southern Illinois reported credible evidence that citizens corresponded with Confederates both to recruit for the Confederate Army, but also to retard recruiting efforts for the U.S. Army. The most important investigation undertaken by federal law enforcement officers occurred in northeastern Ohio in the summer and fall of 1861. There, the U.S. Marshal and Attorney employed a secret agent who collected information on secret groups in several counties. They kept Attorney General Bates apprised of their investigation. In October, amid state elections in Ohio, the U.S. Marshal at Cleveland arrested several prominent Democrats, and the U.S. Attorney brought them before a federal magistrate. Testimony given in preliminary hearings established the existence of the KGC organization in the area. There were several confessions. The conspiracy case, however, collapsed on the eve of trial in federal district court when witnesses suddenly died or ran away under threats from the persons who were facing indictment. While federal law enforcement officers worked hard to investigate criminal conspiracy in aid of the Confederate rebels, their efforts were stymied by bureaucracy in Washington. Gee, that sounds familiar. Attorney General Bates was overwhelmed by the pressive problems that rebellion posed. While he ordered his officers to pursue conspiracy investigations, he provided them neither guidance nor tangible assistance. Most importantly, he possessed no funds to give to law enforcement officers to investigate criminal acts. The Judiciary Fund, established by Congress in the 1850s to pay court officers for carrying out duties such as serving warrants and securing prisoners, afforded no help for investigations. Secretary of the Interior Caleb B. Smith of Indiana controlled the Judiciary Fund and strictly limited its use to the functions prescribed by law. In 1861 and 1862, he turned down requests from federal law enforcement officers for funds to pay detectives to investigate criminal conspiracy. The lack of funds to hire detectives was the critical stumbling block for civilian law enforcement to pursue criminal conspiracy in the North during the war. Nonetheless, in 1862, continued reports suggesting the existence of subversive secret societies, say that 20 times, prompted law enforcement officers in Indiana to initiate grand jury investigations. Over 200 witnesses testified. Jurors announced that evidence showed that KGC existed all over the state. The grand jury's report, released for publication, created a sensation throughout the Northwest. Further investigations produced numerous confessions of membership in the society. Elsewhere, the U.S. Attorney at Cincinnati obtained confessions of KGC membership, and in 1863, a federal grand jury in Cleveland concluded that they had no doubt that secret organizations existed. But none of these investigations and confessions produced a trial, let alone a conviction. Civil officials were hamstrung and no closer to confronting the threat that the organization posed. Neither state nor federal civil authorities had the resources required to tackle the problem. If civilian law enforcement officers lacked money, the U.S. Army did not. In 1862 and early 1863, local commanders at military posts in the Old Northwest initiated investigations of perceived threats to the integrity of Army units. Officers saw that opposition to the war was growing in the northern states and that volunteer enlistments in the Army were slowing. Desertion was on the rise as soldiers became disenchanted with military life and the direction the war was taking, especially after President Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation made ending slavery in the Confederacy a war aim. Soldiers slunk away from their units in droves. Beginning in the summer of 1862, the Army, with its wealth of manpower and other wartime resources, stepped into the investigative void vacated by civilian authorities. Their action was in part prompted by the War Department order of August 8, authorizing civil authorities to arrest and jail anyone who discouraged volunteer enlistments and gave aid and comfort to the enemy. The order also suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus to those arrested. Army officers turned their attention to investigating the sources of dissension and disloyalty in the North that discouraged enlistments and encouraged desertion. Desertion was a huge problem at this time. Thousands of soldiers were missing from the armies, especially the armies that primarily recruited from the Midwestern states, Army of Cumberland in Tennessee. The first military efforts in the Northwest to spy on local individuals and groups occurred in the summer of 1862 around Cairo, Illinois, deep in Egypt, southern Illinois. Prompted by widespread unrest, Major Joseph W. Merrill, the post-provost marshal, working under orders from his local commander, investigated anti-war activities in surrounding counties. With affidavits in hand recounting secret meetings and other suspicious activities, troops swept through several communities and arrested a number of prominent local Democratic leaders for being active in the KGC, including William Josh Allen, the local congressman. In Indiana, the first Army efforts to investigate the activities of secret political groups occurred in December 1862. Colonel Henry Carrington had arrived in the summer to organize and drill new volunteer units. In December, he discovered that soldiers in Army camps around Indianapolis had joined secret organizations that aimed to encourage desertion. He promptly investigated the problem, employing as detectives troops who had learned the secret handshakes and signals of the groups. He arrested and court-martialed soldiers who confessed to membership. Carrington notified President Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, and Governor Morton to his findings. The governor connected these efforts to weaken the Army through desertions to the political struggle he was then fighting with anti-war Democrats who advocated the end of the war on the South and separation of the Northwest from New England. From then on, Morton insisted that Carrington be stationed in Indianapolis to uncover the machinations of anti-war conspirators. Carrington spent most of the rest of the war at Indianapolis, directing investigations of secret organizations in cooperation with Morton. He and the governor unmasked what they believed was a significant threat to the warfighting effectiveness of the Army and the integrity of the Union. To the east, in Ohio, Army commanders perceived growing dissension in local communities. The national debate in early 1863 over passage of the Enrollment Act created a federal draft apparatus that prompted much outcry and determination to resist government tyranny. Communities armed themselves explicitly to resist the draft and protect deserters and draft dodgers. Officers saw that morale among the troops was weakening and that desertion had skyrocketed. In response, in March 1863, Brigadier General Horatio G. Wright, the commander of the Multi-State Department of the Ohio, authorized the establishment of a corps of detectives. Here he's in a major general uniform, but at that time he was not confirmed as major general. Consisting of both hired civilians and soldiers detailed for special duty, these detectives ranged all over the department to track down deserters and draft dodgers. They also investigated arms trafficking to disaffected groups and individuals, and visited communities where armed groups defended deserters from arrest. They shadowed arms salesmen and traced shipments of guns and gunpowder to violence-torn communities in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Purchases of guns and powder became so widespread among anti-war Democrats that Wright issued an order to prohibit arms and ammunition sales throughout the region, throughout the multi-state region. Post commanders in the region attempted and failed to stop shipments of guns and gunpowder from getting into the hands of persons they deemed to be disloyal. Wright's ban was the first of several Army orders banning arms sales to occur in 1863 and 1864. Observing the widespread unrest in the North, Union commanders in the South, with mandates to quell occupied regions, also sent their own detectives to investigate conditions north of the Ohio River. In one instance, William Truesdale, the head of detectives for the Department of the Cumberland, headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee, dispatched operatives northward to track down communications through the lines between Confederates and sympathizers in the North. In another case, a general in western Kentucky sent a captain into southern Illinois, whose investigations confirmed the existence of the KGC throughout the region. These frontline commanders shared their findings with their northern counterparts in the hope of aiding the effort to suppress disloyalty in the North. That spring, as the challenge from anti-war Democrats grew increasingly violent, district and post commanders in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan established their own detective bureaus. They employed a mixture of hired civilians and soldiers. Officers issued their soldiers civilian clothing to venture into communities to sniff out arms shipments. Others posed as deserters to infiltrate networks that provided hideouts, food, and arms to runaway soldiers. For the rest of the war, detectives provided significant information to local commanders who used it to make arrests of deserters and their aiders and to quell unrest. Most of the commanders who created this ad hoc network of Army spies had had experience at the front where tactical military intelligence efforts were routine. In this way, they transferred their battlefield intelligence experience to behind-the-lines efforts to control an increasingly restive home front. In doing so, they uncovered the influence of secret organizations behind the efforts to resist the authority of the government and weaken the war effort. In addition to the detective forces formed by district and post commanders, the Enrollment Act, passed by Congress in March, established a nationwide espionage network of special agents under the Provost Marshal General Bureau, part of the War Department. And this is a photograph of James B. Fry, who was a regular Army officer who was appointed to command the Bureau. Their duty was to find and arrest deserters and draft dodgers. To find them, agents acted as detectives and spies. They sometimes donned disguises to track down their quarry. They worked to infiltrate groups that harbored, protected, and armed deserters. Agents frequently cooperated with military commanders in operations to round up and arrest deserters and draft dodgers, often sharing information about the secret organizations that smuggled arms, resisted arrests, or attacked draft enrollment officers. Their work was dangerous, and some were killed doing their duty. Regulations allotted 4 agents to each congressional district, but sometimes federal authorities permitted extra agents when a local problem was severe. In one case, a district provost marshal in western Illinois had 19 agents scouring the landscape for deserters and working to infiltrate the organizations that harbored them. Elsewhere, the state commander of the Bureau in Ohio, Colonel Parrott, reported in the summer of 1863 that his spies watched the movements of the secret orders group, the secret group's leaders, quote, some of whom hold high political places, end quote. Together, often working in tandem, the 2 detective forces, the one under regional army commanders and the other under the Provost Marshal General Bureau, gathered information on secret organizations behind much of the unrest in the northwestern states. In Illinois, detectives from both forces worked to counteract the local armed groups that threatened enrollment officers and soldiers sent to arrest deserters. In Ohio, they combined to gather information on groups actively working to obtain arms. In Michigan, the post commander and bureau officers at Detroit together hired spies to keep careful watch on Clement L. Vallandigham while he sojourned in exile in Windsor, Canada, and ran for governor of Ohio in absentia. This is, by the way, this is a newspaper rendition of the arrest, rather romanticized version of his arrest at his home in Dayton, Ohio. By the way, actually, this was an intelligence operation because this was ordered by the post commander at Cincinnati, who had his arrest came about because he had made a speech at Mount Vernon in Ohio, and that speech was watched by 2 officers of the 115th Ohio Regiment who had been sent there in disguise in civilian clothes to take down his speech, and that order appears in records at the National Archives for the post commander at Cincinnati, who was the person who ran the intelligence operations out of Cincinnati. They also watched, the detectives working out of Detroit also watched the host of rebels, escaped POWs, and deserters who congregated in Canada. The Army routinely ran detectives across the border into Canada. Midwestern espionage had an international flavor. And this is a report from here at the National Archives here in Chicago of a guy who was hired shortly after Clement Vallandigham appeared at Windsor, and he took up residence in a hotel in Windsor, which is, if you know your geography, it's just across the river from Detroit. So it was very close to the United States, and he was in constant contact with his political followers in Ohio and elsewhere. And so this guy, John Macafee, who I've tried to figure out who he was, and I haven't been able to figure this out, who this guy was, but he was hired by local commanders, does a daily account of what Vallandigham was doing. And in the report, he calls him Mr. Jones. So he says, Mr. Jones went fishing and returned at 7 p.m. Mr. Jones meets with so-and-so and so-and-so. And several of those people that he meets are rebel officers who had taken up residence in Canada. And so he's constantly, and according to this and other reports that come up in the records, he's constantly, Vallandigham was constantly in contact with rebel soldiers. And so, well, anyway, I'll get ahead of myself. Working together, in July, the 2 intelligence efforts in the Northwest achieved their first important successes. In that month, the Provost Marshal General Bureau in Indiana, cooperating with officers from the Department of the Cumberland, shadowed and arrested the founder of the KGC, George W.L. Bickley, in New Albany, Indiana. After being a prominent public figure in the immediate antebellum years as leader of that organization, Bickley more or less disappeared from public view and sojourned in the rebel-controlled South. He had earlier been a resident of Cincinnati. Evidence points to him residing in Western Virginia, where he participated in Confederate guerrilla operations. In July, Bickley and a woman appeared at the Army of the Cumberland headquarters of Major General William Rosecrans, representing himself as coming directly from Richmond, Virginia. He desired, he said, a travel pass to Cincinnati. A suspicious Rosecrans granted him the pass, but ordered detectives to follow him and to make sure that he went straight there. In the meantime, Rosecrans notified Major General Ambrose Burnside at Cincinnati of the notorious man's movements. Bickley's appearance in New Albany and deviation from his appointed route prompted his arrest. Officers searched him and his companion and found many KGC papers. Commanders originally planned to try him by military commission, but Secretary Stanton locked him away in prison untried for the rest of the war. At the same time that Bickley ventured northward, purportedly to Cincinnati, Confederate guerrilla General John Hunt Morgan's division of rebel cavalry crossed the Ohio River and invaded Indiana and Ohio. Union forces pursued the rebels for weeks and finally captured Morgan and the remnant of his forces in northeastern Ohio. Ever since then, historians have wondered why Morgan made his foolish raid, which resulted in the destruction of a division of the Confederacy's best cavalry. In 1864, Henry Carrington, still in Indianapolis, still working as spy master, reported that he understood what had happened. The raid, he wrote, was meant to aid a rising of the secret organizations in the North. In the spring of 1863, Carrington had continued to gather information on conspiracy in Indiana. In April of 1863, he published in Indianapolis newspapers an expose of the rituals of the KGC, showing it to be tied to the Southern rebels. Later in 1864, two of his detectives managed to infiltrate top echelons of the KGC's successor organizations. They provided him with important details about the plans of the conspirators, including what had happened during Morgan's raid. Thus, over a year later, Carrington reported that two factors had contributed to the failure of the KGC to rise during the raid. First, he wrote, quote, the exposure of the ritual of the KGC had demoralized the order so that they knew not whom to trust, end quote. If you can read that, he says it right there. Second, let me stick here. Second, a messenger sent by one of Indiana's leading conspirators to confer with Morgan had been, quote, rudely treated, end quote, by the guerrilla chief. That's William A. Bowles, by the way. His name is underlined here. You see there. Bowles had loose lips, and he talked too much, and Carrington's spies got a lot of information from him. This scotched the plan, which was for members of the order to draw militia weapons when the invasion alarms sounded, but to join forces with Morgan. Carrington's 1864 assessment is most intriguing, and surviving records in the National Archives and elsewhere lend credence to it. We only lack records from Democratic and Confederate sources to confirm his conclusion about the link between Northern conspirators and Morgan's raiders. Carrington's theory of a secret organization in disarray in the spring and summer of 1863 gains strength when we understand that later in the summer, the KGC organization changed its name, leadership, and ritual. Again, Bickley was in federal prison by this time. The new name was the Order of American Knights, or OAK. He has that as a title of this report, the OAK. Army detectives and informants provided piecemeal information to commanders detailing the reorganization. In October, again, 1863, on the eve of the Ohio elections in which exiled Clement Vallandigham ran for for governor from his perch in Windsor, the deputy provost marshal at Richmond, Indiana, arrested a group of heavily armed Illinois men en route to Ohio. Interrogations established that they had planned to interfere in the Ohio election. Significantly, the officer found a paper on one of them that mentioned the OAK. In November, a deputy named David Turnbull, and here's a picture of him from a county history, from Warren County in western Illinois, working for the Provost Marshal General Bureau, reported, quote, "The order is known now by the name of American Knights," end quote. It numbered, he said, 75,000 in the state, maintained contact with rebels in the Confederacy, collected arms on a large scale, and planned on an uprising. His inside source, he said, was one of the good Democrats in the community. Turnbull continued to be an important conduit of information into 1864 and later became a county sheriff in Warren County, Illinois. In December, again, still 1863, the commanding general at St. Louis received an anonymous letter from Illinois detailing the existence of, quote, "the Golden Circle with a new name, the Knights of America, or Marion," end quote. The renamed group met secretly, sported secret passwords and signs, and plotted, quote, "a general uprising," end quote, in the West in order to, quote, "cripple the federal authority so that peace will be obliged to be made and the South acknowledged," end quote. The most significant and revealing report on the revival of the secret society came from a spy named Robert L. Jeffries. Here's a photograph of him. Jeffries was a 25-year-old Missouri-born physician. In the spring of 1863, he was in Cincinnati, and on April 21 found himself under arrest on suspicion of smuggling medical supplies into the South. Army interrogators learned that he had lived in Missouri up to 1862 when he left the state and on account of bad health. A property owner in Mississippi, he stated he had opposed the Union War of coercion, but had refused a surgeon's commission in the Confederate Army. Instead, he and his family had gone north to escape the fighting. Cincinnati authorities held him in prison for weeks before releasing him on swearing an oath of allegiance. At some point thereafter, commanders recruited Jeffries to be a spy. In early November, he told officers at Cincinnati headquarters about his travels in the border area of eastern Illinois and western Indiana near Terre Haute in September and October. There he was initiated into the OAK, which had a military organization and aimed to foment a general uprising. Nearby cells of the OAK were drilled by a rebel soldier nicknamed Powderhorn, and if you know there's a bit of lore around him, this person, in that period of that area of the Midwest. In particular, he said local leaders in the two states had gathered secretly in Chicago in September to raise funds to purchase arms. They planned to attack Camp Morton in Indianapolis to release Confederate prisoners of war. Jeffries' report and those of Turnbull provide the fullest surviving accounts of the reorganization of the secret organization into the OAK and its plans for violent uprising. Jeffries continued to work as a spy on the payroll of the Cincinnati Post commander. However, his identity as an Army spy was blown in northern Kentucky, where men working for Confederate agent Thomas Henry Hines seized and killed him in January 1865. And this episode is well documented in the memoir of George Lightning Ellsworth, the famous telegrapher of John Hunt Morgan, who served as a Confederate secret agent in the North under Hines's orders. And in fact, this photograph comes from the collection, the Thomas Henry Hines collection at the University of Kentucky. And if you take a look at it, if you read it, you might be able to read it. It says, Dr. Jeffries of St. Louis, Missouri, died near Paris, Kentucky, about the 1st of February 1865 with his boots on. Underlined, federal detective. And if you read some of the other things around it, it gives a few more details. So, and this is all confirmed in the memoir written in the 1880s by Lightning Ellsworth. This guy was an effective spy, but he got caught. As Jeffries, here I am. As Jeffries noted in his report, the new OAK organization planned attacks on prisoner of war camps in the Midwest. The most advanced plot to release rebel POWs was focused on Camp Chase outside Columbus, Ohio. During the run-up to the Ohio elections in October, commanders in Detroit and Ohio received reports from informants that Clement Vallandigham planned to return to his home state, perhaps with armed assistance. Army and naval forces were vigilant to prevent his return to the United States. Meanwhile, commanders received reports of arms smuggled into Ohio. While they worked to intercept the shipments, they issued orders to troops to avoid collisions with the Democrats lest they provoke disorders. During this time, detective forces were active in infiltrating secret groups. Back in the spring, the general commanding the District of Ohio created an intelligence bureau to watch the state, appointing Major William Rainey, a former Cincinnati police detective, to lead it. Most of Rainey's detectives came from soldiers in his 7th Ohio Cavalry Regiment. Rainey's men successfully infiltrated a plot among Ohio and Kentucky Democratic political figures and rebel sympathizers. 2 days before the Ohio elections, detectives reported to the commander at Columbus that the following night an attempt would be made to release the 2,000 rebel POWs in the camp. They would seize the camp arsenal, then march on the state penitentiary to release John Hunt Morgan and his officers, and then make for Kentucky. Commanders made quiet preparations to resist the attempt, but the attack was postponed from day to day. Election day passed, with Vallandigham being trounced in a Republican landslide. One of the soldier detectives continued to meet with the conspirators, however, who were intent to try again. They rescheduled and again aborted their plot. As a report by the commander at Columbus makes clear, and the reports in the National Archives in Washington, officers believed that they were in complete control of the situation and had no fears that the plot would succeed. Officers aimed to arrest the plotters in the act, so that they continued to wait until they tried to make their move. But in the end, after several aborted or postponed attempts, troops and U.S. Marshals went ahead and arrested the plotters in Columbus, Cincinnati, and Covington, Kentucky, and brought them before a federal court in Cincinnati, charged with conspiracy and treason. The successful breakup of the plot to attack Camp Chase had a ripple effect. Papers seized during arrests indicated that conspirators planned an attack on Camp Morton in Indianapolis and to foment a general insurrection on November 15. Major Rainey sent copies of seized records to officials in neighboring states, including Governor Morton of Indiana and the commander at St. Louis. Military commanders in Indiana took the warning seriously and quietly put state troops on alert against attack, which did not come. The episode reveals a significant degree of information sharing between military and government leaders in the region. And it's notable that throughout this process, no word of these confidential precautionary steps emerged in the partisan newspaper press. This was kept secret. Almost at the same time, detectives warned of another planned attack on a prisoner of war camp in Ohio. Agents employed by officers at Detroit, ever watchful of the rebels based in Canada, got wind in early November of Confederate plans to attack the POW camp on Johnson's Island in Sandusky Bay, where 2,000 rebel officers were held. The plan called for an armed steamer manned by Confederate troops to attack the naval vessel guarding the island. Detroit officers took the reports seriously and notified commanders in Ohio. They sent detectives to track the Confederates normally found in Windsor, but who had suddenly disappeared. They scoured Canadian towns and ports eastward to the Welland Canal, looking for the rebels and the steamer. In the meantime, commanders in Ohio made preparations to engage and defeat the attackers. Simultaneously, British colonial officials in Canada independently learned of the rebel plot to attack Johnson's Island. the British ambassador in Washington informed Lincoln's administration. Secretary Stanton met the issue by releasing the news to the press. Learning that their plot was exposed to the newspapers, Confederate commanders abandoned the expedition. In Detroit, detectives soon told their officers that the rebels had returned to Windsor, frustrated by military preparations and disappointed in their plans. A significant international incident which could have damaged already tattered relations between the U.S. and Great Britain had been averted. An important element in military officers' success in investigating and infiltrating secret groups derived from the widespread practice of intercepting and opening private mail. Records show that commanders regularly inspected private letters. While postal authorities sniffed at these ungentlemanly actions, they cooperated. After all, they were political appointees put into office by Lincoln's administration. They aimed to aid the war effort and sometimes alerted commanders to suspicious letters. For example, in Dayton, Ohio, shortly after the arrest of Vallandigham and the riots that practically destroyed half the town, the postmaster turned over letters directed to the former congressman and other residents. Elsewhere, postal officials cooperated with the Army. Brigadier General Jeremiah Boyle at Louisville instructed one of his subordinates to open suspicious mail only when a postmaster was present. In other cases, military authorities may have acted without consulting local postmasters. In his zeal to counteract secret plots to subvert the draft and aid deserters, the commander of the Provost Marshal General Bureau in Ohio ordered one of his district officers to intercept and examine letters. And authorities in Detroit, eager to read the mail between suspicious people on both sides of the border, sought permission from Secretary of War Stanton. The military practice of opening private mail became routine and continued into the next year, yielding important information that commanders employed to counteract the plans of the conspirators. While the focus of this talk deals with events of 1863, it is important to note that military commanders continued to investigate anti-war activities into the following year. At the end of 1863, the War Department discontinued the Department of the Ohio. Most of the officers who supervised espionage operations in the Northwest moved on, seriously disrupting investigations. Only the network of secret agents employed by the Provost Marshal General Bureau, the post commander at Detroit, and now General Henry Carrington, still at work in Indiana, continued to collect information on conspiracy. Nonetheless, the commander of the newly formed Northern Department, Major General Samuel Heintzelman, gradually realized that the region's turmoil was caused by internal threats posed by secret organizations acting in concert with Confederate agents. By relying on Carrington's expertise and help from the Detroit officers, he rebuilt the Army's knowledge base and worked closely with the region's governors to counteract the secret organizations. In the summer and fall of 1864, Heintzelman, Carrington, and others successfully forestalled uprisings in Indianapolis and Chicago. The Chicago plots, which focused on releasing Confederate prisoners of war at Camp Douglas, and here's a picture, have been the subject of much comment over the years. Professor Karamansky, in his excellent study of Chicago in the Civil War era, makes note of the two conflicting historical views concerning the Chicago plots. On the one side is the traditional view, dating from the 19th century, that the plots were real and posed a genuine threat. On the other side is the revisionist, so-called revisionist school, led by historian Frank L. Clement, who argued that the plots were myths concocted by Republican politicians and politically minded officers to smear Democrats. Professor Karamansky takes the middle ground in this dispute, correctly noting that the matter is confusing. But research in Army records in the National Archives points clearly to the existence of real plots and substance and menace. In the Camp Douglas plots and other instances, I submit that archival records show that commanders and politicians did not fabricate the existence of secret organizations and their plots. They were gravely concerned about the rise of threats in the region. Commanders formed detective bureaus in order to gather information on the threats with the aim of defeating them. Authorities amassed evidence of the existence of secret organizations which had large memberships and malevolent intentions. Detectives and spies successfully infiltrated the groups and learned their secrets, which included plans to attack POW camps and raise insurrection. In 1863, military detectives successfully broke up plans to release Confederate POWs. In the following year, Army spies learned of plots to foment revolution in the Northwest, and that would have thrown the Union war effort into chaos. Commanders acted to arrest the plots and prevent disorder throughout the region. It's all in the records. The National Archives here in Chicago and in Washington, D.C. contain significant details about the Army's intelligence operations in the Northwest. The records clearly support the so-called traditional 19th century understanding of the reality of internal threats in the North. Historians who consult the records must reject the revisionist interpretation that has clouded the picture of events in the Midwest for many years. The sooner historians turn away from that erroneous school of thought, the sooner they will realize and discover that the North was a hotbed of dangerous movements and threatening activities. So, in conclusion, I wish to thank my archival colleagues, none of whom I see here, for their kindness in helping me to dive into the massive holdings of the National Archives, both here in Chicago and at DC. Together, we uncovered this little known but significant historical secret. And thank you for attending.
We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Any questions?
I've always seen reports of Wild Bill Hickok, the Western law enforcement agent, as being a Union spy, but never seen specifics on it. I know it's not exactly in the Northwest Department, but
Right.
Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, have you ever run across any
No, I
substantial
haven't.
reports?
I haven't seen anything about him, but there are some good places to check. There are records in Washington in Record Group 110 that are, what are the terms that they use? It's essentially records pertaining to scouts, spies, agents, detectives, and using all the terms that the Army used. And I'm forgetting the series name, the series number, but there's a good bunch of that there. A lot of it is Civil War, but a lot of it is later 19th century stuff, so he might have been active in that. Again, he could have been a scout, and so the idea of a scout was a person who rode ahead, who checked things out. And so, yeah, I'm sure that the Army was using scouts in the West extensively in that way. Yes, sir.
Have you ever seen any documents of Union Army officers cooperating with the enemy in terms of maybe like cotton trade, et cetera, et cetera?
No, that's not, and there hasn't been the question was, are there records regarding cotton trading? I haven't focused on that. There is a lot of research that has been done on that, on the cotton trade, which was sanctioned, and that was part of Union policy through the Department of the Treasury and all that. And Army officers were closely involved with Treasury agents to buy Confederate cotton and sell it on the open market. And there's a large historiography on that. But that said, there were detective operations trying to stop certain smuggling, trading operations. There was a group, I'm thinking of, there's some records that I ran across. I didn't chase after this. they would have sent me out of my way. But there's a bunch of records there were of concerning Columbus, Ohio businessmen who were trading with Confederates through the Mexican port of Matamoros. And so the Army detectives in Ohio were tailing these guys, and they sent guys to New York City to trail some of the businessmen, because the trading was coming out of New York City, and they would go sail into the Gulf to Matamoros and things like that. So it's really quite extensive. It was outside my purview, and so I wanted to stick. But there is stuff like that in the records. There's tons of records.
Professor,
Yes.
could you tell us, is there any evidence in these archival records that this movement had any influence upon the legislatures that came into session in January '63 after the November '62 election? For example, in Illinois, the Democrat Copperheads pretty much took over the House and Senate and did all sorts of things that resulted in Governor Yates proroguing the legislature and sending it home until the next election. So is there any connection or any influence that you've been able to discover?
In a word, no. But that's what Governors Yates and Morton understood, and that's what they believed. There's not records surviving that show that of that kind of collusion going on, but they believed it. There's a wonderful letter Governor Yates writes to Governor Morton in January of 1863. He's saying my General Assembly, controlled by Democrats, is revolutionary. He uses the term revolutionary, and he's scared to death. And says, what are you doing about it? You know, we've got to work together against these guys. Morton worked closely with Carrington, as I mentioned, to try, and Morton made the connection between the efforts to weaken the Army through desertion and to the efforts by Northern politicians who were openly espousing the concept of separating the Northwest from the Northeast, from New England, and also allying themselves with the South. So, but in a word, no. There's no smoking gun document that shows that. Now, there were a number of those Democratic politicians who were quite open later in admitting that they were in cahoots with Confederate agents. Some of this comes out in the treason trial in 1864 in Indianapolis. Some of this comes out later. There was a guy in Indiana named Bayless Hanna, who was an Indiana politician, and it comes out in John Breckinridge's Castleman's memoir. He was a Morgan Raider, and he's captured. He becomes a secret agent out of Canada. He's captured in Western Indiana. And for a while they can't figure out who he is, but later he writes a memoir in the early 20th century saying that Bayless Hanna flashed him secret signals, and this is a significant Indiana Democratic politician during the war and afterwards. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
You make the case that, I think you're making the case that the argument these traitors to the Northern cause had was to maintain the status quo. But I'm interested in commerce.
Mm-hmm.
And was there not the notion that it was to the benefit of the Northern businessmen to trade in a government that is one, rather than it's just between separate governments?
The issue is about commerce. In 1861, war and cutting off the Northern producers from Southern consumers greatly troubled Northwestern people. And because the South was the market for Midwestern produce, corn, oats, wheat, and so on. And so with cutting off of Southern markets, people were greatly concerned, and they feared the economic consequences of war. So they said, we've got to compromise. We've got to give in to the Confederate demands, because this is going to be economically devastating. Because all their trade was north and south, north and south. What happened, though, in the course of the war, though, is that trade becomes increasingly east-west as Midwestern produce is shipped by train, increasingly shipped by train to eastern markets and cut off from the southern markets during the war. And it greatly changed the economic balance between the Northwest and the Northeast. But so really, it's one of the aspects strongly that appears strongly in 1861, 1862 among Northwestern Democrats, that we've got to restore connections to the South because they are our market. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I
Okay,
have
one
a
more
question. Is there any connection between these secret societies during the war and the eventual development of the Ku Klux Klan out of Indiana?
That's a question that's often asked. I really can't say. Though we have to remember that secret fraternal societies were ubiquitous in the 19th century. This is what men did. Everyone joined fraternal organizations, Masons, Odd Fellows, and they proliferate later in the 19th century. They got them out of the house, got them out of the hands of their wives. So these kinds of mechanisms are commonplace in male culture in the 19th century. Now, there has, the rise, the Ku Klux Klan rises in the late 1860s and early 1870s as a terrorist organization to drive out, to terrorize the African Americans in the South, and to make life difficult for the army who were trying to reconstruct the southern states. So, but I don't know of any direct connections, no.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.
One quick administrative announcement. Some people have asked for the forms for continuing professional development units for teachers, and those forms are at the registration table. We didn't have them this morning. We're sorry, but we've got them now.
We have time for a coffee break now, 15 minutes. Please come back at 10:30.